1861, Part 2. We left off with Lincoln suspending the writ of habeas corpus. Let's get into the second half of the year. Now, in early July, the Confederacy would earn another significant victory, the first major land battle of the war, with the Battle of Carthage in Missouri. Then we get to Manassas, or First Bull Run. The South named its battles after nearby towns, the North after waterways. Pierre Beauregard from Sumter is part of the Manassas action here. He had 35,000 troops protecting Richmond. July 18th, 1861, Irvin McDowell, the commander of the Union Army, marched his army of 37,000 into Virginia, but McDowell was not what one would consider brave by the standards of 1861. He did not want to fight. He had to be pressured into doing so. He would take 2.5 days to march his troops 25 miles. Beauregard was warned of McDowell's movements by a Southern belle who had concealed the message in her hair. And we have many spies, of course, throughout the war on both sides. Women would play an important role in many battles. As spies, of course, they worked on the front lines. Some even dressed up as men so that they could fight. We are going to get to a couple excellent essays later in the term about the role of women in the Confederacy as well as the Union. It's an excellent topic for a paper. Talk to me about that if you want some ideas on sources. Anyway, Beauregard, again, is warned of McDowell's movements by a Southern belle who had concealed her message in her hair. And he would consolidate his forces along the south bank of Bull Run, which was the river north of Manassas Junction. And from there, he would wait for Union troops to arrive. July 21st, 1861, the first Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, begins. Outnumbered Confederate troops begin to give way to the Union until Thomas Jackson appeared with his fresh troops. General Bernard B. of South Carolina would state, quote, "Look, there is Jackson with his Virginians, standing like a stone wall." And this is where we get the name Stonewall for Stonewall Jackson. Though there is some question as to its intent. Were his men standing and not allowing anybody past as a stone wall? Or was B saying that he was just standing there and not doing anything like a stone wall? So there's a little bit of confusion there. Stonewall, of course, would take on a positive allusion going forward. And Jackson was an important part of the Confederacy, Lee's right-hand man. And of course, we'll talk later about how he eventually succumbs in war and is buried in two places. Southern troops would hold firm. Exhaustion set in at 4 p.m. Beauregard ordered a counterattack. Jackson urged his soldiers to yell like furies. And this is where we get the term rebel yell. It would become a hallmark of the Confederate Army. When they would go into battle, they would yell. They had this scream. Unfortunately, it's never been recorded. I guess they didn't have their phones out back then when they were battling. But this was something that many Union troops would talk about was pretty scary when they would come after them with this sound, with these screams, with the rebel yell. It was disconcerting to say the least, and especially in this battle, it would play a big role because this is early in the war. Many Union troops don't know what to expect, and here you have these Confederate troops who are attacking verbally as well as physically. Troops led by E. Kirby Smith were essential to the defense as well. The attack by armies led by Joseph Johnston, James Jeb Stuart, a big player in the war, Braxton Bragg, and Jubal Early, who is one of my favorite Confederate generals. The Union would end up retreating. This would turn into a rout, and there was mass chaos as Union fighters left the field. Panic gripped many of the soldiers, some of whom simply dropped their arms and retreated as quickly as possible. There are some descriptions of these men literally dropping their arms and running the other way. This is a big victory for the Confederacy, even if only for psychological reasons. The next day, Lincoln would name George McClellan commander of the Army of the Potomac and signed legislation for enlistment of 1 million troops to last 3 years. Now, this is a huge change from what we see after, or what we see prior to and after Sumter. Again, Lincoln called for troops on a 90-day enlistment. The Confederacy begins to win battles, and it wins this major battle, and he realizes, okay, we need to do this for 3 years. So there is a large difference there. This is also the beginning of transition of fighting styles from lines of troops facing off, trying to just outflank the other, to new weapons and tactics in future battles. I had mentioned the Jomini strategy in 1861 Part 1, and this came to fruition at Manassas, after which both sides realized they needed to reorganize and develop new plans. The Confederates focused on a concentration of force, though, which determined the battle, but they did not follow the beaten army back to their capital in D.C. Some argued this was a missed opportunity. The Union Army was beaten. They were humiliated. They retreated. What if the Confederacy had followed them and kept up the attack? This was a relatively small force at the time. They were overconfident and suddenly humiliated. And again, there are stories of them running from the front in the rear. Was this a golden opportunity for the Confederacy? There are a few things also to look at here. Again, I mentioned the Jomini strategy, each side kind of lining up against the other, and this would somewhat change after this time. But for the Confederates, this was very much, again, a success. We'll get to what McPherson terms the irony of Manassas here in a little bit. Henry Villard reported on the battle for the New York Tribune. Quote, when the Unionists resumed their advance, the rebels successfully resisted their rather desultory attacks at different points. With every unsuccessful onward attempt, there was a rapid melting away of the assailants. Fewer and fewer officers and men could be rallied for another advance. Toward 4 o'clock, the rebels felt strong enough to take the offensive. A brigade with a battery under Early, managed to strike the Federal right on the flank and rear and throw it into utter confusion, which spread rapidly along the whole front. Now came the disastrous end. Without any formal orders to retreat, what was left of several organizations yielded to a general impulse to abandon the field. Officers and men became controlled by the one thought of getting as far away as possible from the enemy. Now, this is Henry Villard, again, reporting on the battle for the New York Tribune. And indeed, there were many people who actually came and sat and watched the battle. It actually was a form of entertainment. D.C., again, very close to Manassas Junction. So you had different officials, Union officials from D.C. would go down to watch the battle, spread out, like treated it almost, again, as it was entertainment. They spread out picnic blankets. They had picnics. They watched the battle, again, from afar just to see what could happen. And this is what they witnessed. Villard, again, captures this very clearly when you think about, again, the general impulse to abandon the field. These Union fighters gave up rather quickly, and this, again, gave quite a bit of confidence to the Confederates. Another firsthand reflection from the battle comes from Walt Whitman. Hopefully you're familiar with Walt Whitman. He described the return of Union soldiers to Washington. Whitman knew how to write, so I'm going to just quote this. Quote, the defeated troops commenced pouring into Washington over the Long Bridge at daylight on Monday, July 22nd. The day drizzling all through with rain. The Saturday and Sunday of the battle had been parched and hot to an extreme. The dust, the grime, and smoke in layers sweated in, their clothes all saturated with the clay powder filling the air, stirred up everywhere on the dry roads and trodden fields by the regiments, swarming wagons, artillery. All the men with this coating of sweat and rain, now recoiling back, pouring over the Long Bridge. A horrible march of 20 miles, returning to Washington, baffled, humiliated, panic-struck. Occasionally a rare regiment in perfect order with its officers, some gaps, dead, the true braves, marching in silence, with lowering faces, stern, weary to sinking, all black and dirty, but every man with his musket, and stepping alive. But these are the exceptions. So from Whitman's description, and again, very pro-Union guy here, he's saying that these troops were defeated, not just on the battlefield, but psychologically. They did not have any clue what had just happened to them. Hey, they're in the Union. They have all this industrial power. They have the wealth. They have the manpower. They have the moral side, right? I mean, that comes later, but some of them already feel this. And here they go down to this battle and they get whooped. Again, this causes quite a bit of disillusionment for many. Some would leave the military. Some, though, would jump back on that horse, if you will. And this is where we get to what McPherson calls the paradox of Manassas. How did Manassas affect people's thoughts about the Civil War? Well, for the Union, I just mentioned, they are disappointed, they're disillusioned, they're shocked. So what this loss did was empower them. They realized, hey, we are in a real fight here. This isn't going to be over in 90 days. We need 3-year enlistments. We need to take the action to them. We need to figure out what's going on and change this war around. For those in the Confederacy, hey, this is a big victory, right? Not only on the battlefield, but psychologically, they're feeling pretty good about themselves. Ironically, they become the overconfident group, kind of take some things for granted. They do not step up their game after this. Of course, anybody knows, whether it's in sports, war, whatever, if you're doing well, hey, that's great, but you need to figure out how to only improve from there. And this is what we see, and that is the paradox of Manassas. Again, after this battle, McClellan is appointed as commander of the Department of the Potomac, replacing McDowell. He would later tell his wife, quote, "I find myself in a new and strange position here. President, Cabinet, General Scott, and all deferring to me. By some strange operation of magic, I seem to have become the power of the land." Now, McClellan was a heck of a general. He inspired his men that they would follow him into battle, do anything, but he was obscenely arrogant. This statement alone betrays that. And McClellan, Little Mac, Little Napoleon, was truly one of the characters of the war. He will, of course, run for president in 1864. I'm going to give you a spoiler here. Lincoln defeats him. But McClellan, very popular among his men, but he makes so many mistakes during the war, which we're going to get to. But again, his character is off the charts. Many great quotes come from McClellan. He's really one of my favorite people in the war, not because of his success or his quality, but just because he was quite the character. So again, we'll get more to him later on. Now, what else happens after this? Missouri. Initially, the state did not take a side in the affair. It did not secede, but it did not wholly throw itself behind the Union. They would not join the Confederacy at this time either, but they would not materially nor physically support the Union. They had a Confederate-leaning governor, then a Union-leaning governor. The state would devolve into chaos, with guerrilla warfare becoming a staple of life in Missouri throughout the war. So, again, you have these two sides even in Missouri. Some wanting to support the Union, but they do not officially do this. But they do not officially support the Confederacy. But many take the battle into their own hands. They take the war to the jungles, if you will, and they fight a guerrilla war. There are some excellent books on this if you are curious. Guerrilla warfare, of course, will be an important part of the war throughout. It certainly helped the Confederacy. And even after we see the peace, many Confederates will go to the forest, etc., in the South to continue to fight in a guerrilla style. Now, we also have in September the Fremont Affair in Missouri. Now, who was Fremont? He was the Pathfinder, was his nickname, because of his popularity due to the exploration of the nation. Fremont was an explorer who had helped map routes throughout the West. He had helped name the greatest state in the Union, Nebraska. You should have known that, right? Well, he helped name the territory anyway. More importantly for this story, he was a rabid abolitionist. And remember, he was the Republican nominee for president in 1856. And what was the origin of the Republican Party? To stop slavery, initially to stop the expansion of slavery, but it was an anti-slavery party. Unfortunately, though, he was not a great major general. Administratively, his department was in shambles, and he was considered corrupt. But he was also not very wise politically. In August of 1861, he made his Fremont Proclamation. In this, he declared that all slaves in Missouri were freed if their owners refused to swear allegiance to the Union. Now remember, Missouri's not officially part of the Confederacy, but they're not wholly supporting the Union either. He made this declaration without even consulting the president, Abraham Lincoln. On the 11th, Lincoln would revoke General John C. Fremont's unauthorized military proclamation of emancipation in Missouri. Remember, this was not the goal of the war at this point. And Lincoln, politically pragmatic, did not want to lose these border states. In Missouri especially, this could be a key state. If it officially went to the Confederacy, it could be a problem. Anyway, Lincoln would later relieve Fremont of his command of the U.S. Army and the U.S. Army Department of the West and replace him with General David Hunter. Why is this problematic? It strengthened Confederate resolve and could lead other border states, again, over to the Confederacy if they recognized this was the real reason of war. Fremont really endangered the Union considerably here. Of course, he acted on the best of intentions, but he overstepped his bounds. Lincoln asked Fremont to rescind his order. Fremont refused. Lincoln was then forced to overrule him, which didn't look good for a couple of reasons. First of all, you have divisions within the Union ranks, and this angered many abolitionists who welcomed Fremont's proclamation. So Fremont takes steps to avoid being relieved of his duties. He sent his wife, daughter of Thomas Hart Benton, to D.C. to plead with Lincoln, but they found no luck. Fremont thus decided if he did not receive the order, then he would not have to abide by it. And set up his many aides and bodyguards in a way which would prevent any officer from D.C. from getting to him. Now, of course, you think about this is just absurd, but logically, I guess it makes sense. Hey, the teacher didn't send out the assignment, so I didn't do the assignment. But again, for him, he thinks, hey, if nobody tells me that I've been relieved of my duties, then I'm not relieved of my duties. Lincoln, of course, a wise guy, a wise dude. He knew that this would be Fremont's strategy, so he sent orders to General Samuel R. Curtis in St. Louis, who would be in charge of overseeing the transfer of power. He informed Curtis to employ, quote, safe, certain, and suitable measures to make sure the orders got through. 2 messengers were sent in the hopes one would get through. Indeed, a Captain Thomas McKinney disguised himself as a country farmer to get through, and he eventually would hand the order to Fremont, who was not pleased. Fremont tried to stave off replacement, though. As Lincoln stated, if the battle was imminent, he was not to be relieved, so Fremont tried to initiate a battle to make it imminent. No Confederate troops were nearby, though, so he had to give up. But this was not all we would hear from Fremont. In the 1864 election, some radical Republicans would look to him to defeat a moderate, somewhat conservative Lincoln for the Republican nomination. When we get to the 1864 election, there are many ups and downs. Of course, in history, we look back, well, Lincoln was so popular. Certainly, he just run roughshod in that 1864 election. Final numbers would bear this out, but prior to that, it was not so certain. And Lincoln himself, even a few months before the election, thought he was for sure going to lose. And in November, we have a major change, one which would be the first of many up until this time. Again, General Winfield Scott, a longtime war hero in the United States, was general-in-chief of all Union forces. He would resign, and on November 1st, Lincoln would appoint Little Mac, George McClellan, to the same role. Lincoln tells Little Mac, quote, the supreme command of the army will entail a vast labor upon you. McClellan, in classic response, I can do it all.